1 a.m., a knock. My daughter collapses on my doorstep, lips split, eye already swollen, whispering the name that used to mean family. For a heartbeat, the world vanishes into the hum of the clock and the shallow rasp of her breath. Then I pull my uniform from the drawer, press the badge against my palm, and the shape of what must be done becomes terrifyingly clear. If betrayal stings you like it did me, hit like, subscribe, and drop your story below. You'll want to hear how I turned pain into a plan. The hallway light cast a narrow, dull strip across the runner rug. It trembled with each quick step I took. The metallic smell of antiseptic hit me before I reached the door, like a memory of hospital nights I'd prefer to forget but never could. When the door swung open, she was a figure half fallen against the frame. Camilla, hair in a mess, one cheek already blossoming purple, a split lip that made her mouth a small, crooked wound. Her breath came in ragged little bursts, the rhythm of it more like a broken metronome than anything steady. The clock on my phone read 1 o'clock. Time shrank and sharpened into a single point. I guided her inside before questions could take flight. Her knees gave way, and I caught her as if I had always known how to. The wood of the threshold was cold under our shoes. I could smell the copper of blood and the faint, sharp tang of alcohol on the air around her, the residues of someone's violence and someone's bad choices. My uniform lay folded in the drawer like a promise I had not been ready to use for myself tonight, but the weight of the badge under my palm felt inevitable. I told myself to breathe. My training told me to check for open wounds, to catalog, to preserve evidence. My mother's heart wanted only to press cotton to the split lip and make the world whole again. "Pablo," she said at last, voice a thread. "He hit me because of her." Those words detonated inside me. Calling him by name was like naming the animal that had crept into our house. Memories flipped. Mealtime conversations. The way he smiled with his hand too long on her elbow. The before and after stitched themselves in a second. I moved through the motions as if running on rails. Sweep the hair away, lift the chin, tilt the light. The fluorescent hum from the kitchen ceiling seemed suddenly enormous, as if the room's every sound were magnified into accusation. "You're safe now. Tell me everything," I said, voice low and precise. More officer than mother in that moment, though both roles hummed in my veins. Camilla's fingers dug into my sleeve. Her eyes were wet and unfocused, but she began to talk in staccato shards. Half sentences about a party, about an argument, about a drunken laugh that spiraled into cruelty. I listened and photographed. My phone's camera found the small contours of violence, a crescent bruise that arced under the eye, a shallow purple bruise beginning along the jawline, a spread of darker marks along the side of her abdomen that made my stomach go cold. Each picture was a small, terrible ledger. We drove to the hospital in a wordless car, dawn trying to make something like normal on the horizon. The fluorescent hospital lights were a white ocean. They took nothing away, but they made every bruise a fact, every cut a document. Dr. Letitia moved around us with that clinical clarity doctors wear when they have learned how to separate what hurts from what needs doing. She recorded, signed forms, murmured sympathetic things I barely heard. Her pen scratched on paper in a rhythm that matched the metronome of my heartbeat. A nurse offered coffee. I drank it out of reflex, bitter and hot, a sharp thing to hold in my mouth, while my mind arranged evidence like puzzle pieces. Senora Alma appeared at the emergency room door like a weathered angel. She had been up, she said, heard a commotion through the thin walls. Her knuckles were raw from years of tending a garden, and she had the sort of eyes that missed nothing. She held out a small USB drive in a palm that trembled, not from fear but from the weight of being the carrier of truth. "I filmed it from my window," she said simply. "She was at your door, Senora. I saved it." The tiny plastic stick sat between us like an offering and a weapon. Back home, I spread everything across my kitchen table. The hospital forms, my photos, Camilla's clothes in a paper bag. The house had the odd silence of a place where people sleep but do not speak. My training nudged me into sequences. I labeled photos. I recorded the time on each image. I backed up footage to 2 different places. The officer in me knew the chain of custody mattered. The mother in me wanted to hide the bruises under scarves and let sleeping ghosts be. I balanced those instincts like scales. Romero's name came to mind then, an old contact at the public registry who owed me a nod after a favor years ago. I dialed him with one hand while the other smoothed Camilla's hair. His voice was cautious on the other end, a man who had seen papers bent by greed. I told him to search the land records to flag anything under our names. He hesitated for a heartbeat and then said, "I'll look tonight. If there's anything, I'll call." Even his small assent felt like a crack in whatever web had been woven around us. When Senora Alma handed me the USB, I did not expect the way my stomach dropped as the footage played. There was Camilla, wrapped in a coat, trembling at my doorstep, her whole body telling a story that pushed past any lie. The camera was grainy, the angle imperfect, but the tremor in her hands was real. She knocked, then pressed herself to the frame, and then ran, fast, barefoot, abandoning whatever dignity hunger had kept in her pockets. In one frame, her face was turned up toward the sky, eyes wide with a terror I had not seen in my own flesh. I watched it, again and again, until the kitchen light stung my eyes. As I rewound and scrutinized, another image slid across the screen. Less dramatic, almost bureaucratic. A close-up of a paper. A stamp, a scrawl that did not belong to any of us. Romero called while I watched it, and his voice had a hollow in it I had learned to recognize. "Valeria," he said slowly, "there's an entry. Your name and Camilla's on a transfer. It looks like a signature, but it isn't right." My throat closed. The footage from Senora Alma's camera had caught more than my daughter's flight. It had, in a blink, opened the shutter on a fraud. My hands shook as I photographed the screenshots, labeled files with all the precision of a forensics report. I recorded the timestamp of the video, the format, the file name. I backed up copies to my encrypted drive and to a secure cloud folder I rarely used for personal matters. Each act of preservation felt like a small ritual against the chaos that had walked through my door. I felt my training anchoring me, method, evidence, procedure, while my mother whispered that nothing could undo what had been done. Camilla curled under a blanket on the couch, exhausted, breathing easier now that movement had ceased and she was surrounded by witnesses. I sat across from her and let my eyes memorize the gentle slope of her ear, the tired line at the corner of her mouth. At times my thoughts ran like a prosecutor's notes, witness, motive, means. At others they fractured into image after image of the hand that had struck her. I pictured him, Pablo, smug in his certainty, the kind of man who assumed loyalty was a leash he could yank. I remembered the small betrayals first, the way he had insisted on handling certain bills, the odd excuses when names on paperwork blurred. Now those small things were veins leading to a larger hemorrhage. I called Santiago from the kitchen table, my voice steady as stone even when my chest was a furnace. He told me to hold everything, to document, to not engage with Pablo directly. "We need the footage, the medical reports, and anything at the registry. Don't sign anything," he advised. The legal language was precise and cold, and it suited me. It made a plan where none had been. I breathed out, feeling like I was exhaling on a map, each instruction a road to follow. Late into the morning, I ran through the footage again because I could not help myself. There, tucked between the frames of Camilla fleeing, was a close-up of a ledger, hands moving papers, a pen scratching. It was an accidental exposure, a sliver of truth lost in a jostle of elbows. The scrawled name was familiar enough to chill me, an imitation of my signature, with a tremor that betrayed its falsity. The document bore the registry stamp and a transfer line where our ancestral land had been moved, to a name I recognized from whispered conversations and shameful asides. The mistress. The image resolved into a proof I had not been looking for but had somehow summoned. Sleep became a betrayal I could not afford. I sat with the lamp on and reviewed chain of custody procedures in my head, the necessary steps to convert a home video into courtroom-grade evidence. I thought of Dr. Letitia's notes, of Senora Alma's steady hands, of Romero's reluctant confirmation. I thought of Camilla's whisper, because of her, and of the slow, deliberate plan that had to follow. This was no longer only about a bruise. It was about a life unstitched by a man who believed he could take anything, even names, on paper. I did what officers do when they cannot sleep. I turned facts into form. I wrote a list. Photograph every bruise again at dawn. Log timestamps, duplicate the USB, get signatures from witnesses, notarize copies, secure Camilla in a safe place while legal motions were prepared, contact the woman at the registry to request certified copies, seal evidence envelopes. Each task was a small order in the howl of fear. When the house finally exhaled into the kind of quiet that prefaces action, I sat with the footage paused on the frame that showed the forged signature. The image burned into my retina like a brand. My hands were steady now, not from calm, but from a grim, righteous sort of focus. The city around us was waking into its usual rhythms, oblivious to the private war that had just begun inside my kitchen. The bruises would mean hospital visits and doctor statements. The USB would mean a witness who had decided to do what was right. Romero's registry search had given me a lead that connected brutal hands to greedy motives. I did not sleep. I sat and wrote. I organized. I made phone calls that felt like laying out chess pieces. In the hush of dawn, with bitter coffee cooling in my mug and the fluorescent light waiting to hum into full morning, I looked at Camilla and felt the world tilt back into a kind of alignment. There would be lawyers and courtrooms and the long, grinding machinery of justice, but there would also be photographs and timestamps and a video of my daughter running for her life. I let the footage play once more, frame by frame, until the moment that had changed everything. A shadowed figure, a slammed door, a signature that was not ours, sat like a stone in my palm, and I understood that this night had been the start of the plan I would not abandon. Whispers reached me before dawn, a slow current through the alleys and market stalls, carrying the soft, accusing syllables that turned neighbors into jurors. Footsteps slowed when I passed. Conversations folded in on themselves. The town smelled faintly of frying oil and wet pavement, the kind of ordinary scent that makes extraordinary things feel obscene. I felt watched. I weighed that feeling like a scale in my hand. The first note slid under my door like a slug. No handwriting, just block letters on cheap paper. "Shut up," it said, period. A threat theatered with the economy of a single line. My blood went cold for a second, then hot. I folded the paper with gloved fingers and held it like evidence. Another envelope appeared a week later, heavier this time. A photograph of Camilla leaving our house taken at dusk, grainy but unmistakable. The images were meant to shame her, to make her doubt her own memory. They wanted us to shrink. Rumors grew teeth. At the bakery, the woman who once gave me a nod now averted her eyes. At the corner shop, the boy who helped me with parking tickets whispered to his friend and laughed like a knife. Voices clipped into short, sharp sentences. They had the rhythm of a contagion. Fast, infectious, cruel. She started it. "He's a good man." A few went further. "She's abusing her power." Those words landed like a splinter. Then Hector arrived. Slick hair, slicker smile. He carried a leather folder the size of a small coffin and a presence that filled rooms. "They'll say anything," he told me, low and sure, as if his certainty could fold the world back into what it had been. I met his look with a stillness I practiced on patrol. "Then we'll show them everything," I said, voice clear and deliberate. His smile thinned. In the crease of his brow, I read the math of the next move. He vowed to smear to protect. I vowed to expose. Protection began with paperwork and ended with prayers. I signed forms with care, each line a barricade. The temporary protection order was a stack of stamped paper, solid, official, and strikingly ordinary. The judge's signature felt like a hinge closing. We received the legal injunction as if it were a blanket, thin but enough to wrap around a trembling body. I placed the printed order in a folder labeled with Camilla's name and the date, and I felt the fragile bureaucratic weight of safety. Senora Alma opened her home in the way some people open wounds, careful, with antiseptic hands. Her kitchen smelled of lemon and old wood. The curtains were threadbare and the bedsheet patterns were decades out of fashion, but her house hummed with an authenticity mine lacked in that moment. I moved Camilla there, packing her into a plain bag with a few shirts, a worn novel, and the photograph of us at the beach from a better summer. She hugged me, awkwardly, ashamed to need rescue. I pressed my face to her hair and smelled shampoo and the faint bleach of hospital disinfectant. Hand on her back, I whispered instructions to Senora Alma about visitors and phone numbers and times to call. Alma's hands were gentle and exact. "She'll sleep," she said, "and when she wakes, we will feed her as if we feed hope." Therapy came next. Anais met us in a small office lined with plants that made a hothouse of calm. Her voice was like a soft instrument, tuned to the frequency of unraveling things. She did not rush Camila. She leaned in with patience and asked questions that were ladders back into coherence. "What did you feel? When did it start? What do you fear?" Sessions had the cadence of stitches, slow, purposeful, necessary. Camila's first words were fragmented. Later, they became sentences. The work was not spectacular. It was a painstaking rethreading of a life that had been pulled. Meanwhile, I kept moving through the town like a shadow with a purpose. I walked into offices where files slept like sleeping beasts. Romero greeted me with ink-stained fingers and the scent of old paper that belongs to government buildings. The registry smelled of dust and oil, and the faint memory of hands that had signed 1,000 promises. Romero had the sort of hands that hold small histories in their creases. He fed me documents across a table that smelled faintly of copier smoke. "There are entries," he said, his voice low, the way someone speaks of a storm on the horizon. He tapped with a finger the lines on the page. The handwriting was a poor mimicry of our signatures. The stamp was real enough. The transfer lines were coldly precise. At the municipal office, a clerk's pen squeaked like a protest. Men and women shuffled papers with the devoted care of those who move the bones of a town. Ink-splattered fingers left fingerprints on the folders as they turned pages. The air tasted of dust and bad coffee. I watched as Romero traced the path of a transaction, watching the years, the witnesses, the notations. It felt like watching a skeleton being assembled. The forgery was clever, built to look like a hand shaking with grief. But my training taught me to look for the tremor in the ink. The tremor revealed the forgery. Threats became more direct. A voicemail left on Alma's landline, a harsh male voice reciting an ultimatum, a set of teeth in speech. No name. The cadence was a sentence meant to close things down. "You take her away, you lose everything." Short, clean, horrible. A car idled outside Alma's house for 2 nights, its engine a low, deliberate hum. I tracked it with my badge in a pocket and the law in a folder. I recorded license plates and noted times and angles. Fear had a sound. It was a motor idling in the dark. Hector's tactics were surgical. A legal dossier mailed to the local papers, a whisper campaign aimed at those who kept records of community kindness. "She's abusing her power," the leaflet said, as if authority could be weaponized with a smear. The community's gossip moved like a tide, receding and then returning with debris of rumor. I watched faces in the market soften away from me. Once complimentary smiles evaporated. My daughter's name became a rumor's hinge. The cost of truth manifested slowly, and then, all at once, friends became wary, colleagues avoided eye contact, and my supervisor called with perfunctory concern. His voice wrapped in the polite silence of someone balancing career and caution. I balanced that cost against objectives. Evidence, I repeated in my head like a mantra. Evidence would clear truth's throat. Evidence would not charm the court of public opinion, but it would make the judiciary listen. So I collected. I took photographs of Camila's bruises again at dawn, when the colors were truer and the contours clearer. I documented injuries from multiple angles. I filed detailed notes on the hospital's forms, requesting that the doctor's observations be language-specific, terms that would survive cross-examination: contusion, laceration, soft tissue swelling. I sent a formal request to the hospital for medical records. I logged every call, every visitor, every anonymous message. Chain of custody became my grammar. At night, I patrolled a different beat. Observation. I sat in my car in the shadow of a pawn shop Pablo frequented, watching the door. I noted the way his hand rested on his cigarette, the way his jaw worked when he laughed. I took photographs when he left with Adriana and when he returned alone. I timed his comings and goings. Surveillance is patient work. It is the art of waiting until someone's mask slips. There were days when I wanted to drag him into the light and slap him until his face confused itself with shame. There were nights when I wanted to throttle the man who had struck my child. Instead, I breathed into method. Strategy bruised less than fury. The smear campaign morphed into litigation. Hector sent a thick envelope to my supervisor, laden with allegations and innuendo. The proposal was obvious. Make the accuser appear accuserish. The town's rumor mill began naming me in ways that hurt professionally. HR calls were clinical. There were meetings where I answered questions about conduct and conflict of interest and whether my badge had become a shield for private vendettas. We must follow protocol, my supervisor said, eyes trying to be neutral but tilted by politics. The system's indifference is a particular cruelty. It treats everything as paperwork until the person is gone. I pushed back legally and publicly in measured doses. Santiago prepared responses that were precise, the sort that unspooled a lie by attacking its seams. We issued statements emphasizing the evidence, the hospital records, the witness footage, the registry anomalies. We requested that any claims of abuse of power be accompanied by proof and warned that anyone filing malicious suits would face countersuits. We did not shout. We documented. There were moments that felt unbearably intimate. Camilla awake at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling as if reading the cracks. Her voice would be small. "Do they hate us now?" she asked once. I had none of the grand answers. I had only the small truths. We were not alone. We had proof. We had a plan. I told her that. I transformed the raw edges of fear into tasks. Therapy, doctor's notes, witnesses, legal filings. Turning dread into a checklist steadied both of us. We hardened our perimeter literally and legally. Locks changed. Phones were replaced and encrypted. We used burner numbers for contact with witnesses. We set safe times for visits and avoided patterns. I met quietly with a detective friend who gave me tips on preserving footage integrity and on how to request expedited seizures of possible evidence. Every precaution was a stitch over a wound. Then the envelope arrived, heavy and official-looking. No prelude. Inside, under a seal, was a countersuit. My name, accusations of abuse of office, of manipulating evidence, of falsifying records in order to slander a respectable citizen. The complaint was precise and viciously banal. Numbered points, legalese, demand for damages. The paper smelled faintly of a printer and something colder. Intention. I read it twice, then again, then held it to the light as if illumination might render some error, some proof of fraud in the accusations themselves. There was none. The paper was whole. The allegation was a blow struck in broad daylight. After that, the eyes changed. Stares that were once sympathetic angulated into skepticism. Market chatter turned pointed. A child who once waved began to hide his face behind his mother's skirts. The countersuit had given the whisperers license. The town, which had been a community, folded inward. My colleagues at the station moved their seats slightly away from mine in meetings. My reports received extra scrutiny. I felt watched through layers by the law, by gossip, by a legal document that had tried to turn truth into accusation. I closed the folder with the countersuit and placed it between the other documents, the photos, the hospital notes, the USB copy. The folder felt heavier than it had an hour before. The strategy needed to be recalibrated. We had expected resistance. We had not anticipated a preemptive legal strike meant to dislodge our footing and to make the town doubt my motives. Evidence would answer. Procedure would answer. But there are other costs that evidence does not buy. The sideways looks at the market, the curtains twitching when you pass, the silent distance of people who once were friends. I breathed and did what I always do. I picked up the phone and called Santiago. His voice on the other end was steady and close. "We knew it might escalate," he said. we prepare. Preparation meant paperwork and press and more careful sealing of evidence. It meant reaching out to allies quietly, Senora Alma, Anais, Romero, and asking them to stand firm. It meant telling Camilla that she had done nothing to deserve this and that the town's opinion was a tide we could not control but could outlast. It meant accepting, with a cold clarity, that the battle had widened beyond the domestic and had now filed its claim in public. In the hush, after I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the pile of documents. Outside, a dog barked and a bus hissed by. Inside, the countersuit waited like an accusation that would not be reasoned away by my fatigue. The town's patience had a limit, and someone with enough money and a practiced lawyer had just tested that elasticity. I felt the tilt of the world, but I also felt the weight of the folder labeled with Camilla's name, the heavy, stubborn proof that would not vanish under rumor. The wind had turned. The job now was to make sure it did not become a storm that swept us away. The countersuit arrived, and with it the town's eyes shifted. The countersuit arrived like a stone thrown into still water. Its splash sent ripples through everything I thought I could steady. I read the pages in the kitchen light until the letters blurred, each allegation a mirror meant to warp me. Abuse of power, falsified evidence, malicious intent. The paper smelled of fresh toner and intention. An anonymous envelope had already told me to be quiet. Now the law itself had been turned into a weapon against me. Something inside me that had been simmering boiled over, but not into rage. It hardened into method. I stood, walked to the drawer where my uniform lived folded and waiting like a second skin, and felt the weight of that fabric differently. Tonight, it was not only the authority I carried on street patrol, it was armor I would choose to wear for my daughter. I pulled the shirt free, smoothed the creases, and the badge caught the lamplight like an eye. Donning it felt like putting purpose against chaos. The motion was almost ceremonial. Zip, button, straighten the collar, and in those small mechanical acts, my head cleared. Where panic might have driven me to blunt retaliation, the uniform reoriented me to boundaries I respected. Evidence must hold up. Procedures must be followed. Leverage must be lawful. I called Santiago and watched the tiny arc of steam from my second coffee curl into the air as I explained the countersuit. His voice was blunt and steady on the other end. Freeze assets. Subpoena any related footage. Demand certified copies from the registry. Move to protect any witness who may flip. He listed the moves like a chess player naming the opening. I wrote them down, the pen scratching paper in a cadence that steadied me. The copier in the station hummed in the background when I hung up, a comforting, bureaucratic noise that said, systems existed for a reason. The planning phase felt like a montage stitched from small sounds. Rustle of pages as I organized medical reports into labeled envelopes, the muffled thud of a stack of printouts on the table, the soft whir of the office copier replicating documents in precise grayscale. Late-night coffee cooled at my elbow. It tasted bitter now, a reality check. I made lists in ordered columns, item, time, witness, chain of custody. Each entry read like a promise. The screen of my laptop glowed with email drafts to the district attorney's office, typed and retyped until each word could not be twisted into ambiguity. I called Romero and asked for certified copies of the transfer documents. He promised help and warned that forging registry entries was not uncommon among men who believed their money could buy silence. Bring me whatever you have, he said. When I arrived at the municipal office, the air smelled of old paper and toner, the room populated by people whose hands carried ink like a second language. Romero met me with ink-stained fingertips and the look of a man who had handled inconvenient truths before. Together, we traced the trail of the forged signature, tracing the false loops in the scrawl until the forgery revealed itself in the tremor under the stroke. Paper can lie, but even paper contains fingerprints of deception. Surveillance became the scaffold for the prosecution I intended to build. I watched his movements the way I had learned to read danger on patrol. Small tells, habitual patterns, the dull rhythm of a life lived under certain indulgences. Tail shots were patient things. I sat in my car with the engine off and the heater left on low. Night air pressed cool against the window. The metallic clink of my camera strap was a discreet metronome as I peered through the windshield. When Pablo left the pawnshop, he walked like a man with nothing to hide. He did not expect someone who moved between mother and officer would be tracking the cadence of his life. I took discreet photos, angles that revealed proximity without provocation, frames that showed hands passing, a leaning, an embrace that signaled what the town gossiped about. Adriana appeared in several images, her laugh caught mid-burst, a cigarette between two fingers, a head thrown back. The flash of the shutter was soft and private, the sound swallowed by the hum of the streetlight. In one frame, Pablo pocketed a small envelope, sliding it into his jacket with a casual flick. That image became a piece I could parse later. Cash exchanges, routes, opportunities for coercion. Every picture was time-stamped, logged, saved in multiple secure locations. I labeled files with clinical sobriety: location, date, time, witness potential. At home, I laid the surveillance prints against the registry printouts. The juxtaposition made the pattern obvious. The same nights the transfer entries were recorded matched the nights Adriana and Pablo were seen together. Not coincidence. A plan. I could feel the weight of motive settle in my chest like a stone that had finally been named. My oath to the badge meant I could not take revenge that broke the law. My mother heart demanded justice. The only synthesis that could hold both was strategy grounded in legal truth. Preparing for the legal moves involved small rituals of care, double-checking timestamps, ensuring metadata remained intact, confirming that no file had been altered. I made copies of the USB from Senora Alma and placed them into sealed evidence bags. The plastic crinkled with a hollow, determined sound when I closed them. Chain of custody notebooks were opened and a fresh page began. Date, time, handler, reason. These logs read like testimony themselves. Each line I wrote felt like another brick set in a foundation that would either hold or fail in the face of Hector's inevitable cross-attack. There were nights when the stress pressed at the edges of morality. I caught myself dreaming of more dramatic justice, publishing names on a billboard, exposing them to the town's scorn. But I caught the thought and folded it away. My oath was not an ornament to wear when conveniences aligned. It was a rule set to keep my actions from becoming those I despised. Ethics is not the absence of anger, it is the transformation of rage into precise action. Leverage, then, needed to be something the law could recognize. Witness testimony, gained through protection. Documentation whose provenance was undeniable. A record so thorough that lies could not fill the gaps. Securing Adriana's cooperation became the fulcrum of that strategy. I needed her testimony to stitch motive to action, to show the registry transfers were no bureaucratic accident, but a deliberate theft enabled by the mistress's willingness to accept property and by Pablo's cruelty. But people turn at the sight of risk. I had to set a choice, not as an ultimatum, but as a real exchange, safety and a route out, or the cold inevitability of being swept under in a trial that would find them complicit. Finding Adriana was less cinematic than I imagined. She was not at the fashionable bars or the restaurants where gossip boiled higher. I found her in a low-lit place with sticky tables and a neon sign humming above the bar. The smell inside was a mix of spilled beer and perfume that had given up trying to be subtle. She sat alone at the far end, phone lit under her cheek, face tightened into lines I had seen before in photographs, but never up close. Her eyes slid to me when I approached, and for a moment I saw her strip away the performance. Uncertainty, shivering beneath her practiced smile. I sat opposite her and did not speak for a heartbeat. The bar's cheap wood felt solid beneath my palms. "Adriana?" I said, and her name tasted like a legal document across my tongue, heavy and consequential. My voice was low and I kept it measured so the patrons at the bar would not sense what I intended. I reached into my bag and laid out a small stack of photographs and a couple of registry printouts. Her gaze flicked to the images, then to the registry lines, then back to me. Her fingers trembled when she lifted a photo. She had been photographed laughing, leaning into Pablo. The juxtaposition with the forged document made the evening's rhythm grotesque. You can walk into a courtroom and tell them what you saw, I said quietly. You can say those signatures aren't yours. You can say he told you to sign. You can say he promised to take care of you. Or you can do nothing and let this play out on his terms. I watched the muscles in her jaw work. She had the look of someone weighing a winless decision. I'm offering protection, I continued. Witness protection for you if you testify. Legal counsel to reduce exposure. If you help us, we'll help you. We talked in short sentences that held more than their length. I described logistics, a temporary relocation to a safe house, documents notarized, a chance to cut a deal to avoid charges for participation if she cooperated fully. I did not offer immunity. I offered a path off the cliff. Adriana stared at the registry printouts as if their ink had burned her. He promised me everything, she said, voice small. He said I would have nothing to worry about. He said he would make it all mine. Her words carried the hollow of betrayal, not unlike what I had felt when I saw my daughter's bruises. But he never promised he wouldn't drop me if the law looked too close, she added, and there was a brittle realization in that admission. Ethics whispered in the back of my mind while I spoke. Do not coerce. Do not trade favors that will place a woman in more danger. Respect legal boundaries. I weighed those rules against the practical need to remove a predator from someone I loved. The choice I offered was leverage built on lawful support networks, witness protection, legal counsel, verified relocation, not on retaliation. I watched her weigh options, watched fear and self-preservation, and the faint hope of being spared prison dance across her face. She asked questions that revealed the depth of her fear. What if he comes after me? She asked. What if they find me? What if I lose everything? Her hands trembled as she spoke, nails worrying at the corner of a polyester napkin. I answered each with the kind of careful clarity that comes from years of explaining procedures to scared victims. Secure intake, a sealed file, limited disclosure, safe houses whose locations were known to only a handful of people. I did not promise miracles. I promised process. It was the only honest currency I had left. When I left the bar, the night had a different temperature. It was no longer merely about proving wrongdoing. It was about coaxing a frightened woman to stand in front of a room where truth would be demanded. I felt the familiar tug between accountability and compassion. The oath I had sworn did not permit me to entrap or to lie. It permitted me to offer protection and to present evidence in court. Leveraging a confused woman's fear to extract testimony would violate the very principles I had pledged to uphold. So I built the leverage into the law itself, into formal offers, notarized agreements, recorded assurances from lawyers who would be there when the promises were kept. A week later, Adriana called me from a number I did not recognize. Her voice was rough from crying, or from cigarettes, or both. I'm scared, she said, but I don't want him to keep doing this to her. The hesitation at the end of the sentence was a small, beautiful shift. If you can protect me, she added, I will tell everything. Her terms were sensible and blunt. She wanted a safe place, guaranteed legal representation, and an assurance that her cooperation would be documented before she made contradictory statements in the heat of cross-examination. I told her what I could promise and what required legal process. We will submit you as a cooperating witness, I told her. We'll get you an intake with protection services. Santiago will be involved. This will be formalized. My voice was resolute. Inside, a tangle of relief and dread unwound. She had crossed the threshold from potential witness to active participant, and with that crossing came danger and also the only real chance at restitution. She hesitated for a long beat on the phone and then, softly, I'll do it. I'll tell the truth, but I want to be safe. The plea at the end was not theatrical. It was raw, and it landed like a bell. I told her we would move quickly, and I arranged the first steps over the line that separated private conversation from legal procedure. As I sat down to type the email that would set the machine in motion, requesting witness protection intake, copying Santiago, attaching Adriana's statement, I felt the room narrow and then widen. The plan had teeth now, and with those teeth came a new set of liabilities and responsibilities. Adriana's agreement to talk was the hinge on which the upcoming stages would swing. She wanted protection. I promised to do my part to secure it. The night felt like standing at the edge of an uncovered grave and deciding to file the papers that would keep the lid from being slammed back on. The choice was made. The consequences would follow. The first motion hit the clerk's desk like a declaration, Santiago's signature, elegant and deliberate, across the cover sheet. He moved like a strategist, not a man seized by the bright heat of righteous anger, and the pace of his work steadied me. Papers multiplied on my kitchen table, motions to freeze assets, ex parte requests, subpoenas, each stamped with a motion number that sounded small until you said it aloud and imagined the machinery it opened. Romero delivered notarized registry records in a brown envelope, the notary's ink still wet, the stamp pressed into paper like a seal that would not be trivially rubbed away. My hands trembled as I slid the pages into my evidence folder, but my fingers were careful, reverent. Each document became a small, immovable fact. We served subpoenas quietly at first, the kind that move through the system with official gravity. The pawn shop's transaction logs, phone records, CCTV footage from the strip of bar where Adriana had been seen more than once. I watched a bailiff close a folder with a dry, authoritative thud. There is a sound to legality. Paper on wood, the CL ink of a rubber stamp, the soft swish of a robe in a hall. And those sounds settled into me like armor. Santiago's motions argued with the economy of law, freeze assets pending adjudication, preserve digital evidence, grant expedited access to the registry. The judge's docket number came back red and official. It felt like a pulse in the case. The first tangible result was the bank order. We obtained a temporary freeze on accounts tied to Pablo's name. The clerk at the bank was apologetic, fingers pale as he pressed the stamped document into our hands. Inside, the bank smelled like air conditioning and paper, and the teller spoke in the kind of formal language that makes consequences feel more final. A freeze doesn't hum like an arrest. It is quieter. A shudder pulled across financial life. For someone like Pablo, who believed currency could buy silence, the freeze was an inconvenience that tasted like exposure. Not everything moved smoothly. Hector's response arrived the exact way I expected. Theatrical, loud, designed to create spectacle. He bought ad space in the local paper and paid a few social accounts to push a headline that asked questions without offering answers. The smear ads used insinuation instead of accusation. They relied on the town's hunger for drama. Faces I had once trusted shifted in the market. The butcher who used to give me a discount looked at me with the same measured caution he reserved for meat inspections. The smear campaign wanted to make brave silence contagious. Then a witness backed away. It was a small man with a remorseful face who had promised to corroborate seeing Adriana with documents that suggested the transfer was discussed. When the time came, he recanted in a phone call that sounded rushed and terrified. His words were a fog of "I can't" and "they threatened me." The very pattern we feared materialized. A witness intimidated. A thread of the story pulled out by force. My chest tightened like a fist. In that moment, the legal scaffolding felt brittle as paper. We adapted. The chain of custody ledger became more meticulous. Every time a piece of evidence moved, from USB to secure drive, from Romero's hands to the district attorney's desk, someone signed, dated, and logged it. The log pages filled with neat columns, handler, timestamp, reason. I photographed the edges of disks before sealing them in evidence bags. I recorded the serial numbers of devices and wrote down the exact file names and hash values to prove the digital files were not altered. Santiago joked darkly about forensics sounding like prophecy. I learned to love the math of it. Evidence has a language that the court listens to. Metadata, time codes, notarized copies. It is the thing that makes subjective memory into objective testimony. Protecting Camilla from the noise required a different kind of labor. We crafted statements that emphasized the facts without theatrics, prepared a small circle of trusted spokespeople should any call into the press reach them, and trained Camilla on how to answer when strangers asked intrusive questions. PR is its own form of defense. careful, short replies, redirecting interest toward the court's schedule and legal facts, refusing to be baited. I coached her on breathing techniques, that steady voice and gaze, things I'd taught myself on nights when the siren scream kept sleep from me. We used a lawyer-approved statement for local outlets, minimal, factual, resolute. There is dignity in saying less and letting the evidence speak. Adriana's debt became an unglamorous lever. It wasn't poetic, it was pragmatic. The invoices piled up, the loans she had taken in trust of Pablo's promises, the unpaid tabs and the interest notices. These were tangible pressures that had made her vulnerable. Santiago used those ledgers not to shame her but to create context, debt as motive, coercion as currency. The prosecutor can frame financial desperation as a reason someone might accept a fraudulent transfer or turn a blind eye. In the courtroom, motive is less about melodrama than it is about ledger lines. I kept a folder of unpaid notices that Adriana had allowed me to copy. Their paper edges were rough, the ink slightly smudged where hands had worried them. There were confrontations that had the blunt shape of menace. I went to the pawn shop to observe, notebook in hand, though I knew better than to let my temper be visible. Pablo saw me across the room, and the space between us charged. He leaned on the glass counter like a man who knew how to feign nonchalance. "You'll regret this," he said, meaning not to persuade me, but to unsettle me. His voice had the cheap confidence of someone used to threats paying dividends. "I answer only to truth," I replied. The words tasted plain and kept my throat clear. He scoffed, a short laugh that might have been meant to puncture whatever moral stance I carried, but people like him confuse volume for victory. I had evidence now. I had a notarized registry, timestamps, and a witness lined up. Threats are theater. Subpoenas are the long, slow work that transforms theater into testimony. Court prep is mostly quiet work, reading deposition transcripts, assembling exhibits, placing tabs in heavy binders that leave impressions on your palms. I took Camilla to the room where she would rehearse her testimony. I showed her the photographs again, the way to name what had happened without turning a fact into a performance. She squeezed my hand before she left the house that day, and her skin felt soft against mine. Small and fragile like the thing we were trying to remold into something stronger. The taste of copper when I bit my lip is a small, private habit I have when I am thinking too deeply about outcomes. I did it now, and the metallic tang steadied me. Not all obstacles arrived in the open. Evidence gets dirty when witnesses are threatened. Testimony can be made to wobble. A man we thought would be favorable received a visit in the night and withdrew his affidavit. The town's gossip reached the desk of a local journalist who liked a scandal more than nuance and so printed a piece with just enough questions to hurt. I felt the walls pressing inward, but I also felt the scaffolding hold. When Hector filed motions to exclude certain pieces of evidence on procedural grounds, Santiago answered with a motion in limine that tied the chain of custody into knots the court could not ignore. We prepared exhibits with redundant verifications, a digital file accompanied by a notarized printout, a thumbprint on the USB sleeve, witness attestations to the date and time of discovery. Redundancy is the enemy of doubt in court. We also used process as protection for Adriana. Her deposition was taken in a controlled setting with her sworn, with counsel present, and with the record set in stone. We anticipated Hector's attempt to paint her as unreliable and so prepared corroborating evidence, timestamps from the pawnshop's CCTV, records of the envelopes seen passing hands, bank withdrawal slips that matched the nights we had surveillance photos showing envelopes exchanged. Each piece fit together like puzzle pieces that narrowed the space where denial could exist. On the morning we filed for seizure of certain assets tied to Pablo's LLC, the city felt unusually exposed. Paper stamps clicked in the municipal office, and the judge signed a temporary order with a robe-sweeping swish that sounded like a gavel before the gavel. Those sounds, doors closing, the stamp's damp thud, created a rhythm I could now follow, a beat that meant forward movement toward consequence. Romero handed me the notarized copies, and I felt a small, fierce relief. The web was tightening, yes, but like a net designed to hold a single animal. We had to make sure the net didn't tear. Setbacks continued to test us. Hector ran an op-ed in a regional paper that suggested procedural improprieties on my part. He filed motions aiming to disqualify certain witnesses for alleged bias. He ambushed with innuendo, attempting to turn the moral high ground into an accusation of corruption. The poisoned witness became the narrative turn he hoped would unmake us. For a night, I lay awake calculating how much the town's mood might affect jurors, how the smear might seep into the subconscious of decision-makers. But the law relies on evidence, not rumor, and so we doubled down on the admissible. Documenting chains, affirming witness statements, securing notarized affidavits. Amid the choreography of legal moves, I found moments of small humanity. Camilla arriving at the courthouse holding a paper coffee cup, her fingers cold, the steam fogging the lid. Adriana, pale and resolute, signing a protective agreement. Senora Alma sitting in the back row and folding her hands, her knuckles as solid as the proof she'd given us. The room smelled of varnish and paper, and beneath it all the faint sweat of anticipation. I practiced the testimony I would give, measured, factual, the cadence of someone who loved and who had sworn an oath to the law. Days blurred into logistics. Depositions were scheduled, subpoenas served, exhibits numbered and duplicated. We prepared for the inevitable: Hector's cross-examination, attempts to poke holes in memory, efforts to suggest that our motives were personal and thus unreliable. To counter that, Santiago rehearsed the narrative that framed our actions as lawful and necessary, the words aligning like iron rails, so the train of truth could not be easily derailed. Then the court day was set, and the gravity of it landed with a sudden weight. The calendar that had been inked in by the clerk was no longer an abstraction. It was a date that could change everything. Walk into that room and the smallest stumble can be amplified. A witness's falter under cross can unravel months of methodical work. The thought of cross-examination slotted into the back of my skull like a clock that ticked only in minutes of exposure. I felt the case's fragility in every textured page of the binders stacked on my table. The web had tightened around Pablo and his misdeeds, but it had also enclosed us in a space where a single thread could snap. I closed the big binder and felt the leather edge bite into my palm. A small, grounding pain. The sound of the courthouse doors closing in my mind had never felt more like a threshold. We had executed, adapted, and reinforced. Yet nothing in law is guaranteed, and the case that had become my life's work now hung on the hinge of a courtroom where cross-examination could collapse what we had built. The courtroom air was thick and warm, a stillness that made every small sound behave like a shout. No cameras, just wood and cloth and the collective breath of a town that had come to watch someone else's life be remade. I walked to the stand carrying the weight of months. Hospital records, time-stamped footage, registry printouts notarized by Romero, printed emails and sealed evidence bags that smelled faintly of plastic and ink. Each folder sat like a card in a hand I intended to play slowly and without tremor. My voice when I began was steady because steadiness is work. Steadiness is rehearsal and prayer combined. I laid out the map of what had happened in the plainest terms I could muster. The medical report, I said, describes contusions, soft tissue swelling, lacerations consistent with blunt force trauma. The footage shows Camilla at the door at 1 a.m., trembling, then fleeing. The registry entries, notarized and certified, show a transfer recorded in dates that matched nights when surveillance photos caught Pablo with Adriana. Each piece connected to the next, like dots clicked into place. The prosecutor's table hummed with the small efficiency of men and women who do this dance well. The judge listened with a tired face that made me think of someone who'd seen many human things fall apart and, sometimes, be put back together. When Adriana took the stand, the room held its breath as if she were a fragile instrument. She came forward, pale and small beneath a coat that had seen better weather. Her hands were clasped, as if holding herself together. When she began to speak, her voice trembled like a wire under tension. The first words were soft and broken, an apology that sounded like a bell someone tried not to let ring, But as she recited dates and nights and the ways Pablo had isolated and instructed her, her voice gained timbre. She described the ledger, how he had slid documents to her in a pawnshop alleyway, how he'd promised her land deeds if she signed, how he'd told her the signatures could be simple formalities, how he'd assured her that nobody would look too hard. Her testimony was a map drawn in human terms: coercion, fear, enticement by promises that never materialized. When she read aloud the phrases he used, her voice echoed against the wooden walls, and the echo made the language feel like a thing that could be measured and weighed. She described nights of whispered instructions and mornings when cash appeared in envelopes and afternoons when he coaxed her to the registry, telling her it was a necessary step for security. She admitted to signing in places where she wasn't paying attention, to being embarrassed and scared and in debt up to neck high because of his promises. The court heard of invoices left unpaid and of loans she had taken under his assurances. Her testimony bound motive to action, greed married to cruelty. Hector, when he stood for cross, was all polish and practiced outrage. He prowled the distance between his client and the witness like a man performing a ritual he'd repeated many times. His questions were sharp instruments shaped to split a seam. Isn't it true you were alone with him that night? Did you ever express doubt about the signatures? Aren't you admitting now that you feared consequences if you did not comply? He tried to compress her story into holes he could push through. He suggested inconsistencies, highlighted hesitations. Santiago stepped in with the patient rhythm of someone who knows where the truth lives in paperwork. He redirected the court to the hard things: timestamps embedded in the video files, metadata that proved the footage unaltered, notations on the registry copies that matched the dates Adriana mentioned. He set cheap insinuation against notarized documents. When Hector accused Adriana of embellishment, Santiago produced corroborating evidence: bank withdrawal records, a pawnshop ledger with entries that lined up to the nights Adriana described, security footage that captured the very handoff Hector tried to reduce to rumor. The law, when wielded precisely, can be harsher than bluster. It can be relentless. I watched Pablo across the aisle. At first, his face was composed. His fingers twined the way a man in control believes he still is. But small fractures showed quickly. He flushed when Adriana described the envelopes. He narrowed his eyes when camera frames showed a close-up of a hand sliding a thin parcel into his jacket. Hector's bluster could not refill the growing fissures. In court, composure counts for much, and orderly demeanor can persuade as effectively as facts. Pablo's composure unspooled in a slow, visible way. A frown became a tic. A hand that once smoothed his collar now curled into a fist. The audience shifted in their seats. Santiago's voice became a metronome, steady and unhurried, aligning facts with sequence. He asked for the playback of the footage and the judge allowed it. The room leaned forward. The video, projected on a small screen, was grainy but undeniable. Camilla at the door. A figure leaving the pawnshop minutes later with an envelope. A registry clerk stamping a form. The prosecutor pointed to time codes, to metadata readouts that the court's technician verified, files with hash values proving they had not been tampered with since being copied from the USB. Legal procedure can be a kind of poetry when it harmonizes: forms, stamps, signatures, and a chain of custody that runs like a ribbon through every piece of evidence. Hector tried to shout the narrative into the gaps. Suggest that Adriana was acting, that she had motive to fabricate, that debts and anger could be performed as plot. He asked Adriana about her relationship to money, about her debts, about whether she had been coerced by anyone else. His face was a knife. His method was to make narrative feel fluid rather than fixed. Yet when Santiago laid a notarized bank statement next to a pawn ledger and the security footage, the strands braided into a single rope. The cross-examination was theater and technique wrestling for the same prize. Evidence kept tightening its hold. The judge's demeanor remained judicial, reserved, deliberate, but I could see his jaw move as he read through pages and watched images play. His pen tapped a rhythm I recognized as a sign he was thinking through each motion's legal merit. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and the clean metallic tang of stamped ink. Each sound was amplified in a consciousness that was tightly wound with expectation. Slow motion is a trick of narration. Real life rarely obliges, but in the seconds when the judge announced a temporary protection order, when his hand moved to sign and the gavel's hollow rap threaded through the room, time felt like a film reel slowing down. The gavel struck and the sound landed like a punctuation. The clerk placed the signed order into an envelope and the judge spoke the words that would sting into action. Assets frozen, transfer voided pending full adjudication, protective measures enacted for the safety of Camilla and for anyone cooperating with the prosecution. The judge's signature was the stamp where law met consequence. It felt heavier than paper. When the officer at the back escorted plainclothes deputies to the defendant, they moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals. They placed handcuffs on Pablo with a procedure that was neither triumphant nor cruel, simply an instrument of law. He swallowed audibly. The moment the metal clicked, something like a release happened across the room. It was not a celebratory explosion. It was the deep inhalation the air made when a long-held thing finally let go. The court clerk read the terms aloud. Freeze of accounts, nullification of the forged transfer, immediate judicial referral to criminal prosecution. Camilla sat, with her hands folded so tight the knuckles whitened. When the judge finished his pronouncements, she exhaled as if the breath had been held since that one a.m. knock, long, tremulous, and wet with the salt of exhaustion. Her shoulders dropped a fraction and she blinked as if adjusting to the light of having survived something. I cried once then, a single, small sound that did not move me to spectacle, just a private release that escaped like steam. The tears were not theatrical. They were the honest moisture of someone who had been carrying fear and found a map out of it. Victory tasted odd, like ash after a storm, but also like the first rain on dry earth. It was not the coda to a triumphant march. It was a careful turning of pages to a chapter where safety began to be possible again. Justice had not fixed everything. It had not erased bruises nor the months of whispered accusations. What it had done was align institutions with truth in a way that let us breathe without looking constantly over our shoulders. The protection order meant we could plan, not merely hide. The freeze on assets meant mechanisms of coercion were temporarily disabled. Adriana's presence in the courtroom remained fragile but steady. She had been the pivot between rumor and proof, and though her willingness to testify had invited danger into her life, the court's orders now wrapped a legal layer of protection around her. She sat with a guarded calm, and when she left later with a coordinator from witness services, I felt a rough gratitude that carried with it the knowledge of how close things had been to unspooling. When the deputies led Pablo out, his face had the particular pallor of a man who had misjudged the durability of other people's patience. Outside, cameras might later run with versions of the story that simplified shapes and sold headlines. Inside, though, the verdicts and orders were precise instruments, signed pages and stamped envelopes that would be referenced for hearings to come. The gavel's echo still vibrated in my chest as I gathered Camilla's hand and we walked out of the courtroom together. The hall smelled like varnish and a trace of old coffee. People muttered, but their words felt distant, like waves against glass. There was a subtle shift when the courthouse doors closed behind us. The spatial act of leaving a room where truth had been argued had the sensation of emerging from a tunnel into a softer light. It did not mean everything would be easy. There would be appeals, procedural skirmishes, perhaps more attempts to discredit. There would be therapy sessions and nights when Camilla's sleep frayed. There would be paperwork to secure and phone calls to make, but a decisive thing had been set in motion. Legal protection, frozen finances that could not be used as levers, and criminal referrals that would not simply dissolve into rumor. On the walk home, I felt the crowd thin and the town resume its rhythms, but the rhythm of my shoulders was different, less braced. I held Camilla's hand and felt the small softness of her fingers fold into mine. The world was not fixed, it never is, but the immediate danger had been contained with instruments and procedures I trusted. The fight had been long and hard, and the payoff was not a parade, but the quiet restoration of a room where laughter might slowly return. We reached the house, and I paused in the doorway listening to the silence settle like snow. The trial's door had closed for now, and with it the loudest collision of our lives. The long work of repair began, not flashy, not cinematic, but relentless and true. Revenge, I realized, was never about spectacle or watching someone fall. It was about reclaiming the quiet dignity that fear and violence had tried to steal, about turning pain into a shield and a plan. It was about making sure that the bruises no one sees, the hidden ones, the silent suffering, were met with action, protection, and justice. Walking through those months, I learned that true power isn't in humiliation or triumph. It's in safeguarding the people who cannot defend themselves, in restoring a life fractured by betrayal, and in carrying the lessons forward so others might recognize danger before it becomes devastation. Camilla and I were no longer just survivors. We were witnesses to the strength that careful, deliberate justice could wield. The town's whispers shifted, and the quiet respect that followed was a subtle reminder that law and love can coexist in the most unexpected, brutal of circumstances. I returned to my patrols with eyes open to the invisible struggles around me, knowing that vigilance and courage could transform fear into protection. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more real revenge sagas. Share your own below and click the next video for another raw tale.